Good afternoon. I hope everyone is enjoying the conference thus far. My name is Mike Travellini. I'm a second-year MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to announce our next research paper speakers, Carolyn Stein and John Ezekowitz. Their talk is titled "The Hot Hand, A New Approach to an Old Fallacy." Their talk is going to be about 20 minutes, and then we're going to have a 5-minute Q&A session at the end. So please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Hey guys, I'm John, this is Carolyn, and our third co-author, Andrew, unfortunately couldn't be here today. We're excited to talk to you about a new approach to thinking about the hot hand. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carolyn to kick it off.
Okay. Is this where, okay, yes. Okay, so I'm pretty sure that everyone knows what the hot hand is in the context of basketball, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, when we're talking about basketball, the hot hand, it's the idea that a player who's made several of his past shots is more likely to make his next shot. So in other words, it's the idea that shots are not independent events, but they are in fact dependent on what's happened before. So in the academic literature, pretty much everyone is in agreement that the hot hand is a fallacy. And the sort of seminal paper on this topic was this 1985 paper by Gilovich, Valona, and Tversky, The Hot Hand in Basketball on the Misperception of Random Sequences. And what the authors do in that paper is that they look at the probability that they break down data by individual shots. They look at data from the Philadelphia 76ers. And they say, well, what's the probability that player X makes his next shot conditional on he's made his past 4, or he's made his past 3, or he's made his past 2, or conditional on he's missed his past 4, missed his past 3, missed his past 2. And they find that there is no statistical significant difference in those probabilities. And so they conclude that your prior performance does not predict your current performance on the shot you're currently taking. And they also, just look at the length. They look at the sequences of shots that a player takes, and they find the length of streaks of makes and misses that you find in that data is consistent with what you would expect under an independent process. And there have been subsequent studies that have confirmed this. So I would say that the academic consensus is that it's a fallacy. There's sort of a small group of people who are pushing back on this. Stone and Arks both have had recent papers suggesting, but I think we're sort of the first people to, we've got some new data, and we think we kind of have a new take on this. And also just, outside of the academic literature, you've got sort of more mass-geared publications, Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow. You've got Larry Summers addressing the Harvard basketball team, David Brooks in the New York Times, all saying, the hot hand is an excellent example of data exposing human biases. The hot hand, it's a fallacy, it's a bias, and it's not real. But here's the thing. This is the issue that we take with all these analyses. There's this key assumption in the original paper and in most of the work that follows. And I'm actually just going to read this sentence because the authors say it very well. And this is just plainly written in their paper. But basically, the key assumption they make is that they say, it may seem unreasonable to compare basketball shooting to coin tossing because a player's chances of hitting a basket are not the same on every shot. Layups are easier than three-point field goals, and slam dunks have a higher hit rate than turnaround jumpers. Nevertheless, the simple binomial model, i.e. the independent assumption, is equivalent to a more complicated process with the following characteristics. Each player has an ensemble of shots that vary in difficulty, depending, for example, on the distance from the basket or defensive pressure, but each shot is randomly selected from this ensemble. So this idea of players randomly selecting shots, we take issue with. Because here's the thing. Players believe in the hot hand. You know this if you talk to them. They've done surveys. Players, they think that they heat up and they're more likely to make their next shot. So a rational thing for them to do would be to adjust their behavior accordingly. If a player thinks he's heating up, he might try a shot that's pretty difficult that he would normally pass on. So we're actually going to unpack this question into 2 questions. First, do players attempt more difficult shots as they heat up? And then if this is true, are hot players more likely to make their next shot if we control for the difficulty of this next shot? So now we're going to talk about the data. Okay, because the thing that is, so this idea is great, control for the difficulty of the shot, but how is this possible? Well, for a long time it really wasn't. Short of watching hours of NBA footage and trying to guess how hard every shot was that a player took, you couldn't do it. But now we have this new sports view data, this optical player tracking data, and for the first time, that's going to give us a way to sort of see how hard are these shots. So in this paper, we actually we had 4 data sets. We had the NBA roster, so this is going to give you player traits, height, weight, position. And then you've got the NBA expanded play-by-play, so this breaks down every event that happens in the game and who is involved and what happened. Then you have the sport view optical tracking data, and this is the new data set that made this possible. It's X, Y, Z data for all 10 players on the court and the ball every 25th of a second. And so this is going to allow us, the moment a shot is released, to know where everyone on the court is. And that's what's going to allow us to understand how hard the shot was. And then finally, you have the sport view play-by-play optical, which basically allows you to merge the play-by-play with the optical tracking. And so what we can do then is we can generate what we are calling a shot log. It basically, for every single shot taken, we know the time, we know exactly where it was taken, we know what kind of a shot it was, and most importantly, we know where every single person on the court was the moment that shot was released. And from this, we're able to extrapolate how hard was the shot that the player took. So before we sort of dive into the hot hand and our findings, we're going to go over some.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Yeah.
We're going to go over some empirical preliminaries to just sort of make sure we're all on the same page. So the first thing we need to do, we say, we want to control for the difficulty of the shot. So how are we going to do that? So what we need to do is we need to measure shot difficulty. So what makes a shot difficult depends on a lot of factors. We thought it would be really nice if we could condense these down into a single number. And a single number that encapsulates shot difficulty, well, one way to think about it is, the moment the player releases the shot, what do we think is the probability that that shot goes in? If we think it's 0.9, that's a pretty easy shot. If we think it's 0.1, that's probably a pretty hard shot. So if we can sort of reduce this massive amount of data down to that one number, that's nice. It's easy to interpret, we can understand it. So we come up with this model. It's just a linear regression, and so we call this thing called p hat. It's our estimated probability that a shot goes in. And what does that depend on? Well, it depends on game conditions. So that's going to be like, what quarter are we in? How much time is on the clock? Is it a close game? What's the score differential? Then there's shot controls. So this is going to tell you where did the player shoot from, not just distance from the basket. We actually grid the whole court up into 2-foot by 2-foot boxes, because a 12-footer, at an angle is harder than a 12-footer straight onto the basket. So we know exactly what box on the court they shot from, and we know what kind of a shot it was. Then it also depends on how closely are they being covered. So we know how close is the defender to them. We also know, is the defender right between their line of the basket, or is the defender off to the side? We also, is this defender a lot taller than them? Is it a mismatch, or is it, the height differential pretty small? And then finally, we have player fixed effects, because if you're trying to predict how likely is it a shot that goes in, you want to know who's shooting, because different players are better shooters. And so from this model, you get a simple number that sort of encapsulates the difficulty of the shot. The next thing we want to talk about is, what does it mean to be hot? And we sort of came up, there's sort of 2 ways to think about this. There's what we call simple heat, and that's probably what you and I would first think of when we think of as a player hot. It's just what was their shooting percentage over their past n shots. So simple heat sub 4, let's say, would look back over your past 4 shots. If you made 3 out of 4, we'd say your simple heat is 0.75. That was your shooting percentage over those past 4 shots. But then we think about, some shots are harder than others, and if you just made 4 layups in a row, are you really hot? Those weren't very hard. So then that brings us to complex heat. That measures the difference between your actual shooting percentage and your expected shooting percentage over your past couple shots, but it takes into account how hard those shots were. So let's say that a player made 3 of his 4 past shots, and we know from our model, we know what the expected probabilities of those shots were. So the first one was hard. It had a p hat of 0.1. Second one, 0.5, 0.8, and 0.6. Well, so your complex heat, if you made 3 out of 4, you'd be 0.75 minus your expected percentage over those past 4 shots, which we can calculate. It's just the sum divided by 4. Given how hard those shots were, we thought you would make 50%. So you outperform by 0.25. That's your complex heat. So just to sort of illustrate an example here, we've got 2 players who each took 5 shots, and we're going to just kind of run through the 2 scenarios. So on the left, you have Thad Young, and he makes 5 shots in a row. So his simple heat is 100%. He just went 100%. But if you look at these shots, they were not very hard. They were all taken from right around the basket. And so his complex heat is actually only 13% because he didn't really outperform that much. We kind of expected him to make those shots. And then over on the right, you have Clay Thompson. So he goes 3 for 5. So his simple heat is 60%, which is lower than Thad's. But the key difference is that they were a lot harder. And so he actually outperformed, given how hard those shots were, by more. So his complex heat is 25%, which is larger. And so we kind of like this model on the right better because it gives Clay Thompson more credit, which we think he deserves. So we use complex heat to measure how hot a player is. Because you don't have to click, you just touch and point it.
All right, so now that we've got a little bit of the background out of the way, we can turn to the 2 questions at hand. Firstly, do players change their behavior based on their perceived hotness? And secondly, if they do, can we find a hot hand effect if we control for that change in behavior? So how might players change their behavior if they believe in the hot hand? Well, we think they might take shots from further away. Defensive cover might change. The coach might say, we need to cover this guy in a different way or more closely because he's made 3 shots in a row. Or the players themselves might increase the defensive intensity. And players might be more likely to take the team's next shot. All of these factors, if they're true, if players when they're hot exhibit this behavior, all of these factors would lead to shots that when players are hot being more difficult. And if that is the case, then the effect of heat might be masked. You might have a negative effect of players taking more hard shots, masking the positive effect of players having an innate likelihood of making their next shot because they are hot. So here's an anecdotal example of this. This is 5 shots that Ty Lawson took against the Rockets in a game last year over a short period of time. And at the top, you see the shots are color coded by difficulty. So dark shots are more difficult, light shots are more easy. And the X on the court represents where the closest defender was at the time of the shot. So Ty starts off by making a fairly difficult layup, a contested layup at the rim. He then makes a fast break layup with nobody in between him and the basket, by far the easiest shot in the sequence. His next shot is a shot from further out at the elbow, an elbow jumper. And then the very next possession, after making 3 shots in a row, he comes down the court, comes over a ball screen, takes another dribble, and pulls up for a 3-pointer from the right wing. What Ty Lawson did is what is commonly referred to as a heat check. He took 3 shots in a row and came down and took the very next shot that was available to him, regardless of its quality. You might argue that Ty Lawson might not have taken that shot had he not made 3 shots in a row. Even more interesting is his 5th shot after making 4 shots in a row. He ends up taking a leaner with a defender directly next to him affecting the shot. This is what we would call a closely contested shot, and a shot that has a very low probability of going in. So this is anecdotally explaining how shot difficulty might increase because players make different decisions when they believe themselves to be hot. So moving from anecdotal to empirical, what happens when we test this across our sample of over 70,000 shots from the course of the 2012-2013 NBA season? So what you see here is testing the distance of a shot, the defender distance, how close they are, the probability that the shooter takes the next shot that the team has on offer, and the difficulty of that shot. And we're controlling for things like game conditions. We're controlling for things like player fixed effects, the talent of the player when we do these. We just didn't show them for ease. And as you can see, if a player makes 1 more out of his last 4 shots, he's more likely to shoot from further away, and that's statistically significant. He's more likely to have his closest defender be closer to him, and that's statistically significant. And he's more likely to take his team's next shot. That all adds up to more difficult shots when a player is hotter. But the most important thing here is that these are not just statistically significant results, they're actually real-world significant results. So if we look at the effect sizes, and again, let's imagine that you took 4 identical shots and you happen to make 1 extra of those shots. What would we expect to happen based on the data in the regression model? Well, if you made 1 additional shot, we would expect your next shot to be from about 4.5% further away. We would expect your closest defender to be about 1% closer to you. And perhaps most importantly, we would expect that you're 7.6% more likely to take your team's next shot. I think this is actually the most important effect because if you think about it, there's a trade-off between usage, how many shots you take, and efficiency. If players are forcing shots that they wouldn't otherwise take when they believe themselves to be hot, or if they're being fed shots by their teammates, and if those shots are more difficult, that is going to mask any hot hand effect that you might see. It also leads to an interesting conclusion of the converse. When players have missed shots, when they feel that they're cold, they're much less likely to take shots. And so the question that we don't answer but think we could answer could be, as a future research question, are players overreacting? Are cold players passing up shots that they should be taking? A perfect example of this is one of my favorite players and a player who definitely believes in the hot hand, my friend J.R. Smith. So what you have here on the x-axis is JR's shots for the last season, the number of the last 5 shots that he's made. And on the y-axis, you have the percent likelihood that he takes the Knicks' next shot. So in the 112 cases where he's only made 1 out of his last 4 shots, he only takes the team's next shot 30% of the time. But in the 55 cases where he's made 4 out of his last 5 shots, he takes the Knicks' next shot over 50% of the time. Clearly, JR is changing his behavior, and perhaps his teammates are changing their behavior when he believes that he is hot. Okay, so moving on to the main event. Given that shots are not independent, what happens when you control for shot difficulty? Does a hot hand effect emerge? So we did this in 2 ways. First, we wanted to replicate the result from the original Gilovich paper, and this is the same strategy that people have used for a long time. So in this case, heat is simple heat. We're just looking at whether you made or missed without regard to difficulty. And we're including player fixed effects to control for changes in talent between players. But as we've argued throughout this presentation, that's not the right way to think about the hot hand. That way will mask the effect. What you want to do is use complex heat to control for past shot difficulty to find true outperformance. And you want to control for the difficulty of the current shot to account for the effect of players taking more difficult shots when they believe they're hot. So what do we find? In column 1, you see the results of the Gilovich specification. Simple heat, the coefficient is not significant, it's essentially 0. In column 3, we use complex heat and control for shot difficulty. And as you can see, there's a positive hot hand effect, and it's significant. So the effect size here is not large, but it's not trivial. If you make an additional 1 out of your last 4 shots, we would expect, based on this model, that the odds that your next shot goes in is 1.2 percentage points higher. But looking at it through a traditional one-step framework to judge effect size isn't the way that people think about the hot hand. People don't think about players getting hot from going from 1 to 2 shots of their last 4 made. You're thinking about a guy going from 1 of 4 to 3 of 4 or 4 of 4. So if you think about it in that lens, making an additional 3 shots is worth 3.6 percentage points. And if you're a 40% shooter, that's almost a 10% effect. So this is a large real-world effect, but maybe not as large as people would think. So summing up, what have we shown? We've challenged the assumption that has underlied a lot of the hot hand research in the past, that shots are independent. We've shown that players shoot from further away, that defenses cover those players more closely, and that those players are more likely to take their team's next shot. That all conspires to make those shots when players are hot more difficult. Then we've changed the framework that people have used to test for the hot hand to account for that difficulty, that increased difficulty, and we found a small and significant positive hot hand effect. To be clear, this is not NBA Jam style, you make 3 in a row, you're on fire. But it's also not the 30-year consensus in the academic world that players, coaches, GMs, anyone who's played the game is wrong about heating up. I think that, I hope I speak for Carolyn when I say, I think that what we hope that this paper engenders is further discussion, further thinking about the strategic implications. Are players being rational? Are teams being rational? Should players really be gunning when they believe that they're hot? Should cold players not be shooting as often? A future research study might be to look at what happens when hot players pass the ball instead of shooting, Are they being covered more closely and thus other teammates are open? Could that be an effect of the hot hand that we're missing? There are lots of questions to ask. You know, Amos Tversky, who wrote the original paper, once said, "I've been in thousands of arguments about the hot hand. I've won all of them and I've convinced no one."
And I think, oops, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, in general, you know, I think as statisticians, you have the privilege of getting to play in everyone else's backyard. But I think it's also important to take seriously what the people, you know, what the players, what the coaches, you need to listen to them too. And I think we both sort of hope that there's like a more coming together, congenial dialogue on this kind of stuff.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Yeah, this might be a little next level. I didn't know if you had a chance at all to differentiate by position at all, because the hot hand we generally associate with guards, you know, just dribbling it up and chucking, as opposed to like post players.
Absolutely. So we differentiated when we came in the shot difficulty regression. We included the player's position, and we interacted that with the type of shots he was taking. So, for instance, you know, Tyson Chandler taking an 18-footer is different from Kevin Durant taking an 18-footer, and that's at a position level too. But what we didn't do was separate it in the hot hand, testing for the hot hand level. And that's something that you definitely could do. And I think there's a tension here, right? Because when people look at all shots, you know, if you only want to look at jump shots, you're going to miss when a guy takes a layup. And so if Ty Lawson makes 2 layups and then makes a jumper, are we only looking at his jump shot to determine whether he's hot or not? You know, it's hard to say. But I think it's a good point, and it's not something that we had considered at the testing for the hot hand level.
Thanks.
In your assessment of complex heat, how do you control for the fact that, for example, in the Klay Thompson example, you said that his complex heat was higher because of the fact that out of the 5 shots, some of them were harder. But what if the shots that he made out of the 5 shots that he took were actually, let's say, 3 of the easier ones, and he missed the only 2 that actually had that degree of difficulty that makes the complex heat higher?
I don't think that, so I think that if you make a really hard shot in complex heat, you get a lot of credit sort of for that. Yeah. But if you, it shouldn't matter.
Yeah.
Because it's just a subtraction. So basically on the left side, you just have
So for instance, imagine Klay Thompson made 3 layups and missed 2 really hard shots, right? The hard shots he wasn't expected to make, so that's not going to affect the complex heat that much. And the easy shots he was expected to make, so that's not going to be, you know, it's 1 minus, say, 0.9. That's not going to affect that complex heat that much either. Really complex heat is measuring outperformance when you're making difficult shots.
Right, so you could have like a scenario where one guy makes 1 really hard shot and misses 3 easy ones, and he could have a similar complex heat score to someone who missed the really hard one but made the 3 easy ones. Like it's supposed to measure total outperformance, if that makes sense.
Hey John, did you take into effect if someone made 2 or 4 free throws in between, saw the ball go through the hoop, and did that have any effect on it?
No, that's a great point.
That's a good question.
And we did not, no. But that, you know, one of the things that I was just talking about last night is the idea that, oh, a shooter just needs to see the ball go through the hoop. And that's definitely something you could test in the future. If a guy makes 2 free throws at the beginning of the game, does he outperform, you know, over the next time period?
Did you look at different teams and systems in terms of which ones maybe took advantage of the hot hand better than others?
No, we really didn't. We didn't get to that point yet. But that's definitely something that you would want to look at in the future. You would want to see, you know, how different coaches react. And, you know, do certain coaches leave players who have made hot shots, you know, made shots in longer than they would otherwise? And do certain coaches just stick to their rotations, you know?
Yeah.
I think there's probably heterogeneity there, but we just haven't looked yet.
You know, some coaches encourage people to keep shooting, and maybe some don't, and that would be interesting if they're doing badly too. The other.
By the way, I think this is just amazing. It's really cool that you guys did this. Did you look at if the player didn't take a more difficult shot? Because the 1.2% is cool, but probably, I'm guessing you were disappointed, like you were hoping it'd be 5%, you know? And if he didn't take a more difficult shot and just took an average shot, if he had already been heating up, then was the effect greater?
Well, by controlling for the difficulty of that shot, that was essentially what we were trying to do. Like the 1.2 is supposed to be, you know, neutralizing the difficulty of the shot. So if I understand your question correctly, I don't think that should make a difference.
This doesn't work anymore. Sorry, I was trying to go back to the,
Yeah, sure.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah.
No, but going back to the coaching question, what if a coach is pushing a play towards the hot hand, the
Yeah.
perceived hot hand, which then negates the ones who aren't considered hot? How does that factor in then at that point to make this thing a valid example of what a hot hand is? If a coach is suggesting, because we want that player to take that shot, a Carmelo, for example.
So you would expect those shots to be more difficult, right?
Because the play is being run for him, so he's expected.
Right, but
Right, so that's why we're trying to.
You're giving us a great example of why the previous research hasn't worked and why we had to do what we did, which is we tried to control for how hard that shot was.
But he's also being forced by a coach who's asking him to take that shot.
So you think that would add like a degree of like psychological pressure or something?
I think it would encourage him to go ahead and take even a difficult shot because he has to really like.
Right. I mean, I think what you're saying is one of the reasons why we think the effect size could potentially be larger, because if you think about what you do when you find a mean effect size, you're gonna find that best fit. I think, Carolyn, the slope of the line is most likely going to be closer to 0. I know you explain this better than I do, but
I'm not sure.
But anyway, what you're saying is exactly why we wanted complex heat. Right? Because if Carmelo is forced to take that shot, we shouldn't penalize him for.
Is the coach more influenced by the high hand or the player?
We don't know.
That's a great question, but that's
We don't know.
yeah.
That's the issue. Is it the chicken or egg?
So unfortunately, we're out of time for questions. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you.